They say grief makes the walls thin. For Elena, a grief counselor drowning in her own loss after her fiancé Michael's sudden death, the old apartment building was meant to be a quiet refuge. But some silences are heavy, charged. Late at night, when the city outside fades and the weight of her sorrow is most profound, a sound begins, 3 slow, deliberate knocks on her door. Knock. Pause. Knock. Pause. Knock. It's an invitation not from the living or the dead, but from something else, a hollow echo seeking acknowledgement, a parasitic despair wanting in. And the first rule of this place, whispered in the shadows, is simple: don't answer the door if you hear 3 slow knocks. Let's begin the story. Get comfortable and listen closely. The smell of stale cardboard and dust hung heavy in apartment 7B, mingling unpleasantly with the faint, lingering scent of lemon polish used by the previous tenant. Elena surveyed the landscape of her new life, towers of unpacked boxes slumped against walls painted an indeterminate shade of beige, monuments to a future abruptly cancelled. Michael's favorite armchair, salvaged from their shared storage unit, sat awkwardly in the corner, its worn leather seeming to absorb the already scant light filtering through the large, grimy window. Outside, the anonymous roar of the city felt distant, muffled by the building's thick, pre-war construction. This was supposed to be anonymity, a place to simply exist, until the jagged edges of grief smoothed over. Elena, 32, spent her days counseling others through loss. She knew the lexicon, the stages, the coping mechanisms. She could nod with practiced empathy, offer tissues and validated feelings, guide clients through the labyrinth of sorrow. But here, alone in the echoing quiet of the 7th floor, her professional tools felt like foreign objects, useless against the raw, gaping wound left by Michael's fatal arrhythmia just 2 months prior. He'd been fine 1 minute, laughing over breakfast, planning their weekend hike, and gone the next. The suddenness was a physical blow she still felt reeling from. She forced herself through the motions, microwave dinner eaten standing up, staring blankly at the unfamiliar grain of the kitchen counter, a half-hearted attempt at organizing the bookshelf, only to find herself clutching a photo album, tears blurring the images of Michael's ridiculously infectious grin. Isolation wasn't just a consequence of moving, it was a state she actively cultivated, dodging concerned calls from her colleague Daniel, letting texts pile up unanswered. She needed the quiet, or so she told herself, to process. But the quiet wasn't empty, it was heavy, pressing. Her first encounter with Mrs. Petrova happened in the narrow, dimly lit hallway a week after moving in. The elderly woman emerged from 7D like a moth from a chrysalis, wrapped in a faded floral housecoat despite the afternoon heat, her eyes sharp and bird-like behind thick glasses. She carried a small, wilting potted plant. "New," Mrs. Petrova stated rather than asked, her voice raspy, layered with the accent of somewhere vaguely Eastern European. "Elena," she offered, managing a weak smile. "Just moved in." Mrs. Petrova nodded slowly, her gaze drifting past Elena to the heavy wood of apartment 7B's door. "Big building. Old. Holds on to things." She paused, adjusting her grip on the plant. "Feelings, mostly. Echoes." She offered a thin, enigmatic smile. "Be careful what you listen for." Before Elena could formulate a polite, confused reply, the old woman shuffled towards the clanking service elevator at the end of the hall. "Holds on to feelings." The phrase lingered, unsettlingly appropriate. That night, the city's distant hum seemed to deepen, the building settling into a profound silence that felt older than its bricks and mortar. Elena was curled on the sofa, the photo album open on her lap, the specific ache of Michael's absence of physical presence beside her. It was late, well past midnight. The radiators occasionally hissed, the floorboards creaked under their own weight, normal old building sounds she was slowly getting used to. Then came the sound that wasn't normal. Knock. Slow. Deliberate. Heavy, like a fist wrapped in velvet against the thick oak door. Elena froze, her breath catching. Her mind raced. Delivery? Impossible this late. Neighbor? Who? Pause. A silence that stretched, amplifying the frantic thudding in her own chest. Knock. Same weight, same measured pace. Resonating through the wood, through the air, vibrating faintly under her feet. This wasn't the impatient rap of a pizza guy or the tentative tap of someone unsure. This felt intentional. Pause. Longer this time. The silence in the hallway outside felt absolute, unnatural. Knock. The finality of the third knock sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the drafty window. It wasn't aggressive, but it was undeniably present. She sat rigid, straining her ears. No footsteps retreating. No shuffling. Just the thick, waiting silence. Slowly, heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird, Elena slid off the sofa. She crept towards the door, her bare feet silent on the worn parquet floor. Her hand trembled as she reached for the peephole. The brass felt cold. She pressed her eye to the fisheye lens. The hallway stretched before her, distorted and empty. The single, low-wattage bulb near the elevator cast long, wavering shadows. Dust motes danced in the weak beam. Nothing. No one. Just the familiar, slightly eerie emptiness of the 7th-floor corridor after midnight. She stayed there for a long minute, eye pressed to the glass, scanning the vacant space. Nothing moved. Kids, she told herself, pulling back, her breath misting the cold metal. Teenagers pulling a prank. Or maybe someone drunk, got the wrong floor, knocked and realized their mistake. Or settling noises. Old buildings make strange sounds. Grief makes you jumpy, hyper-aware. Her therapist brain supplied rational explanations, but the feeling lingered, the deliberate rhythm, the heavy resonance. It hadn't felt random. It had felt personal. Like a summons. She double-checked the deadbolt, slid the chain across, and retreated deeper into the apartment, the unpacked boxes suddenly feeling less like temporary clutter and more like barricades. That night, sleep was a shallow, restless thing, haunted by the echo of 3 slow, hollow knocks. The following day dawned gray and oppressive, mirroring Elena's mood. She tried to dismiss the previous night's event, burying herself in the mundane task of unpacking kitchenware, the clatter of plates a welcome antidote to the unsettling silence. She labeled it a product of grief-fueled hypervigilance, an auditory anomaly amplified by stress and exhaustion in an unfamiliar environment. She was trained to recognize the tricks the mind could play during periods of intense emotional distress. She repeated this to herself like a mantra. Yet, as evening bled into night, a familiar anxiety began to coil in her stomach. The quiet of the apartment no longer felt like a refuge but a stage, waiting for its cue. She found herself subconsciously listening, tensing at every creak of the floorboards from the apartment above, every distant siren cutting through the city hum. She left the television on, the artificial murmur of a late-night talk show a flimsy shield against the encroaching silence. It happened again, just after 1 a.m., almost precisely 24 hours later. She was trying to read, the words blurring on the page, her focus entirely on the ambient sounds of the building. Then, the silence descended again, that peculiar, weighted hush in the hallway, like the air itself was holding its breath. Knock. Slow. Heavy. Identical to the night before. Her heart leapt into her throat. Not kids. Not a drunk. This was too precise, too punctual. Pause. The silence pressed in, thick and suffocating. Knock. Every muscle in her body tensed. She felt rooted to the spot, the book slipping from her numb fingers. Pause. She could hear her own blood rushing in her ears, a frantic counterpoint to the dead stillness outside the door. Knock. The third knock echoed, final and definitive. This time, defiance warred with fear. She scrambled to the door faster, anger momentarily overriding the chill. She fumbled with the peephole cover, pressing her eye against the glass with determined force. Empty. Utterly, maddeningly empty. The same dim light, the same long shadows, the same absolute stillness. No flicker of movement, no receding footsteps down the stairwell, no sign of anyone having been there mere seconds before. Frustration boiled over. She flung the door open, ignoring the tremor in her hands, the chain catching with a metallic rattle. "Hello?" she called out, her voice sharper than intended, echoing slightly in the deserted corridor. "Is anyone there?" Only the humming silence answered her. The air in the hallway felt strangely cold, stagnant. She stepped out, peering down the long stretch towards the elevator, then back towards the emergency stairwell. Nothing. She felt a prickle of unease, the feeling of being watched despite the visible emptiness. Retreating back inside, she slammed the door shut, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet building, and quickly secured the deadbolt and chain. The next morning, sleep-deprived and on edge, she called the building management company. Their response was polite but unhelpful. "Strange noises, ma'am? Old building, you know. Pipes, settling." They logged her complaint but assured her no other tenants had reported disturbances, and their overnight security patrol hadn't noted anything unusual on her floor. Probably just the building groaning, the receptionist concluded cheerfully. That night, Elena decided to be proactive. She positioned her smartphone on a small table near the door, angled towards it, and started a voice recording app. She sat on the sofa, pretending to read, but every nerve was strained, listening. The pre-knock silence arrived like clockwork, a palpable drop in atmospheric pressure. And then, the knocks. Knock. Pause. Knock. Pause. Knock. She waited until the silence resettled, then retrieved her phone, hands shaking slightly. She stopped the recording and hit playback. Her own breathing was audible, the faint hum of the refrigerator, a distant car horn. But where the knocks should have been, there was only indistinct background noise. A low thud, perhaps, barely distinguishable from the building's usual nocturnal groans, lacking entirely the specific, heavy rhythm and resonant quality she had heard so clearly just moments before. It was as if the sound existed only for her ears, live, in that specific moment. A cold dread seeped into her. This wasn't just strange, it was impossible. A few days later, needing groceries, Elena encountered Mrs. Petrova again near the mailboxes in the lobby. The old woman was meticulously sorting through junk mail, her lips moving silently. Elena hesitated, then decided to risk it, keeping her tone light, casual. "Mrs. Petrova, quick question, have you ever heard any odd noises at night? Like knocking?" The old woman stopped sorting. She didn't look up immediately, but Elena saw her wrinkled hand pause over an envelope. Slowly, Mrs. Petrova raised her head, her bird-like eyes fixing on Elena with unnerving intensity. The air thickened. "Knocking?" she repeated, her voice lower now, less raspy. "Yeah," Elena said, forcing a smile. "Probably just the building, like management said. 3 knocks, kind of slow." Mrs. Petrova's reaction was subtle but deeply unsettling. Her eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. She made a small, swift gesture with her free hand, a flick of the wrist that Elena suddenly, chillingly recognized as a truncated sign of the cross. The gesture was over almost before it began. Then, leaning slightly closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that smelled faintly of mothballs and Earl Grey tea, she said, "Some doors are best left unanswered, dearie." Her gaze flickered towards the elevators, then back to Elena's face. "Not just the wooden ones." With another enigmatic half-smile, Mrs. Petrova turned back to her mail, dismissing Elena as effectively as if she'd shut a door in her face. The cryptic warning hung in the air, heavy and cold. Not just the wooden ones. Elena felt a deeper chill than the lobby's air conditioning could explain. This wasn't just about a prank or building noises anymore. Something else was happening on the 7th floor. The nightly ritual of the 3 slow knocks became the terrifying metronome counting down the hours of Elena's isolation. Dread wasn't just an emotion anymore, it was a physical presence that settled in her chest around dusk, tightening its grip as midnight approached. Sleep became fragmented, punctuated by jolts of wakefulness where she lay listening, waiting, muscles tensed for the inevitable summons. The impact wasn't just anxiety, it was deeper, more insidious. Her grief, already a heavy shroud, felt different after the knocks. Sharper. Colder. The memories of Michael, once bittersweet comforts, now twisted into agonizing pangs of loss, focusing on the finality, the emptiness he left behind. Intrusive thoughts, darker and more potent than before, began to surface with alarming frequency, flashes of the hospital room, the chilling pronouncement of death, vivid imaginings of Michael's last moments. Thoughts of hopelessness, the sheer pointlessness of continuing, whispered at the edges of her consciousness, amplified in the silence following the knocks. It felt as though the sound wasn't just happening to her, it was actively exacerbating her pain, feeding on it. Worse still was the new, bizarre sensation that accompanied the knocks. As the heavy, deliberate sounds echoed through the door, she felt a strange, almost magnetic pull towards it. It wasn't curiosity anymore, not entirely. It was an urge. An inexplicable impulse to acknowledge the sound, to engage with it. Not necessarily to swing the door open into the empty hallway, the memory of the chilling void stopped that, but to respond in some way. To call out, "Who's there?" Or even just to focus her mind intently on the source, to mentally reach out and ask. The urge felt alien, invasive, like a foreign suggestion planted directly into her thoughts. She resisted it fiercely, shaking her head, pacing the apartment, trying to drown it out with music or the drone of the TV, but the pull was undeniable, unsettlingly intimate. One particularly difficult night, saturated with a fresh wave of grief triggered by finding Michael's favorite worn sweater tucked away in a drawer, the knocks felt heavier, more insistent than ever. Knock. Pause. Knock. Pause. Knock. The sound seemed to vibrate not just through the door, but through her very bones. The urge to respond clawed at her. Just ask, a part of her mind seemed to whisper. Just acknowledge it. Fighting the pull, Fighting the tears blurring her vision, she instead pressed her forehead against the cool wood of the door after the third knock faded. Driven by a mix of fear and a desperate need for it to stop, she whispered, barely audible even to herself, "Go away." Silence. A long, drawn-out pause that felt different from the usual intervals between knocks. It felt like listening. Then, a single, soft, almost gentle tap against the other side of the door. Tap. Like a confirmation. A sign of understanding. Almost satisfied. Terror, cold and absolute, washed over Elena. She stumbled back from the door as if burned, her heart hammering against her ribs. That single, soft tap was infinitely more horrifying than the heavy knocks. It implied awareness. Sentience. It had heard her. It had responded to her acknowledgement, however minimal. The interaction, the confirmation of a presence listening on the other side, shattered her remaining attempts at rationalization. She needed to talk to someone. The isolation was crushing her. Despite her earlier reluctance, she called Daniel the next day, initiating a video call. His familiar face appeared on her laptop screen, creased with concern. Daniel, ever the pragmatist, her anchor to the logical world outside the increasingly strange confines of apartment 7B. Elena. "Hey, I was worried. You've been MIA, he said, his voice warm but his eyes searching her face. She tried to keep her voice steady, recounting the events, the persistent nightly knocks, the empty hallway, the failed recording, the chilling feeling. She hesitated, then admitted the urge to respond, and finally, the terrifying single tap after she whispered, "Go away." Daniel listened patiently, his expression shifting from concern to a kind of professional sympathy Elena recognized instantly, the look she herself often gave clients grappling with delusions or profound psychological distress. "Elena," he began gently, "have you considered? I mean, the stress you're under is immense. Losing Michael like that. It's traumatic. Grief can manifest in really strange ways. Auditory hallucinations aren't uncommon, especially when someone is sleep-deprived and isolated." "Daniel, this isn't a hallucination," she insisted, frustration rising. "It's real. The timing, the specific sound, the feeling before it happens." And it responded. "Or," Daniel countered softly, "your mind, desperate for some kind of interaction or explanation, interpreted a random settling noise as a response. Maybe you're hearing your own heartbeat in the silence, Elena? That 3-beat rhythm. It could be physiological. Your brain is trying to make sense of overwhelming emotions." He leaned closer to his camera. "Have you thought about talking to someone? Professionally? You know, sometimes we're the worst at applying our own advice. An objective perspective could really help sort through what's grief and what might be something else triggered by it." His words, meant kindly, felt like a dismissal. He wasn't hearing her. He was hearing her grief, filtering her experience through the lens of psychological disturbance. He saw her as a patient, not a witness. The chasm between her reality and the rational world he represented yawned wide. "I'm not imagining it, Daniel," she whispered, but the conviction in her voice wavered, eroded by his doubt. Okay," he said soothingly. "Just promise me you'll think about talking to someone? And try to get more sleep. Maybe leave the city for a weekend, get some distance?" She ended the call feeling more alone than ever. Daniel's rational explanations, usually a comfort, now felt like gaslighting, unintentional though it might be. She was trapped in apartment 7B, not just by her lease, but by an experience no one else seemed capable of understanding or believing. The entity at her door, whatever it was, thrived in isolation. And now, it knew she was listening. The confirmation that something was truly listening, truly interacting, shifted the dynamic entirely. The phenomenon wasn't just at her door anymore, it began to subtly bleed into the fabric of her reality within the apartment, becoming more invasive, more psychological. The fear escalated from dealing with a persistent, external annoyance to battling an internal infiltration. Elena started hearing the rhythm, slow. Pause. Slow. Pause. Slow, in mundane sounds. The drip-drip-drip of the ancient bathroom faucet, usually unirritated, would suddenly fall into that precise, 3-beat pattern for a few cycles before resuming its normal tempo. Drip. Pause. Drip. Pause. Drip. She'd freeze, straining to hear if it was accompanied by the actual sound at the door, but it wasn't. It was just the faucet, mocking her. The creak of floorboards under her own weight as she paced late at night would sometimes settle into the same cadence, creak. Pause. Creak. Pause. Creak. In moments of peak anxiety, when her heart hammered against her ribs, she'd swear the spaces between the beats aligned with that dreaded rhythm, thump. Silence, thump. Silence, thump. It was insidious, making her question her own senses, blurring the line between external event and internal perception. Was she just becoming obsessed, projecting the pattern onto everything? Or was the entity subtly manipulating her environment, seeding its signature rhythm into her awareness? Once, jolted awake from a shallow sleep, she heard the knocks, knock. Pause. Knock. Pause. Knock, but they sounded closer. Not from the main apartment door, but from inside. From the flimsy wood of the bedroom closet door. She sat bolt upright, heart pounding, staring at the closet in the dim pre-dawn light. The sound had been undeniable. But as she focused, listening intently, the sound resolved back to its usual location, the heavy oak of the entrance door, faint but distinct. An auditory trick? An echo somehow amplified within her own space? Or was it testing her, seeing if it could manifest its presence inside? The ambiguity was maddening, eroding her sense of safety even within her locked apartment. She also began to notice a distinct correlation between the intensity of her grief and the nature of the knocks. On nights when she managed to keep her sorrow at bay, perhaps losing herself in a movie or having a longer, distracting phone call with her sister, the knocks, when they came, seemed fainter, almost tentative. But on nights when a wave of grief crashed over her, triggered by a song, a smell, a memory of Michael's laugh, the knocks were thunderous, jarring, sounding like they could splinter the very wood of the door. They felt reactive, responsive. Drawn to her pain like a predator scenting blood. This horrifying realization led to a new, desperate strategy: suppression. Elena began actively trying to police her own emotions, particularly when alone in the apartment. She fought back tears, forced herself to engage in neutral activities, put on a brave face for an audience of empty rooms. If she felt a wave of sadness coming, she'd blast upbeat music, call someone, anyone, or plunge into complex work files, anything to distract herself, to starve the entity of the negative emotional energy it seemed to crave. It was exhausting, unnatural, like holding her breath underwater. And she suspected, deep down, that it wasn't a sustainable solution. Grief denied doesn't disappear, it festers. Driven by a need for answers beyond Daniel's well-meaning skepticism and Mrs. Petrova's cryptic warnings, Elena turned to research. Late at night, fueled by caffeine and anxiety, she began digging into the history of the apartment building. Using online city archives, digitized newspaper databases, and even trawling through old forums discussing New York City building histories, she started piecing together a fragmented, unsettling picture. The building, constructed in the late 1920s, had seen its share of life and death, like any structure its age. But certain patterns emerged. She found mentions of tenants in her specific wing, particularly on the 7th and 8th floors, suffering from unusually severe bouts of depression or sudden psychological breakdowns. An archived news brief from the 1970s mentioned a man on the 7th floor who simply vanished, leaving all his belongings behind. Neighbors had reported him becoming increasingly withdrawn and paranoid in the weeks leading up to his disappearance, complaining of disturbances. Another article from the late 90s detailed the suicide of a young woman in an apartment just down the hall from Elena's current unit. Friends quoted in the article mentioned her struggles with profound loneliness and despair after a relationship ended, and vague references to her being troubled by strange noises and a feeling of being watched in her apartment. There were no explicit mentions of ghosts or hauntings in the official records, nothing concrete. But the accumulation of anecdotal evidence, the recurring theme of severe depression, isolation, and unexplained psychological distress concentrated in this particular section of the building, felt significant. Vague mentions surfaced in less formal sources, a comment on an old blog post about weird vibes on the upper floors, another about tenants complaining about persistent feelings of despair that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. Elena printed out the articles and forum comments, spreading them across her floor. The rational part of her brain, the grief counselor, could still attribute much of it to coincidence, the statistical certainty of tragedy occurring over decades in a large residential building. People struggling with mental health might be drawn to the anonymity of such a place. But the woman sitting alone in apartment 7B, the woman who heard 3 slow knocks every night, the woman who felt a cold presence react to her grief, she saw a terrifying pattern. The building didn't just hold on to feelings, as Mrs. Petrova had said. It seemed to attract them, cultivate them, perhaps even nurture something that fed on them. And apartment 7B felt like it was right at the heart of it. The fragments of history, combined with her own escalating experiences, solidified a chilling conviction in Elena's mind. This wasn't random. This wasn't simply her grief. She needed to talk to Mrs. Petrova again, not for casual warnings, but for whatever deeper knowledge the old woman held about the building's troubled past and its peculiar moods. She found Mrs. Petrova watering a collection of slightly healthier-looking plants lining her windowsill, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the hallway. Elena knocked softly on the open door of 7D. The apartment beyond was cluttered but meticulously clean, filled with old-world furniture, lace doilies, and the scent of potpourri. "Mrs. Petrova?" Elena began, trying to keep the desperation out of her voice. "Can I talk to you for a minute? About the building?" The old woman turned, her expression unreadable. She studied Elena's face, noting the dark circles under her eyes, the palpable tension radiating from her. She seemed to make a decision. Sighing softly, she beckoned Elena inside with a slight nod of her head. "Come in, child. Sit." Elena perched awkwardly on the edge of a velvet armchair that smelled faintly of lavender. Mrs. Petrova settled opposite her, folding her wrinkled hands in her lap. "You're still hearing it, aren't you?" Mrs. Petrova stated quietly. "The knocking?" Elena nodded, throat tight. "Every night. And it feels like it's getting worse. Like it's reacting to me." She hesitated, then plunged ahead. "I found some things. About past tenants. People who lived near here. Breakdowns, disappearances." Mrs. Petrova listened, her gaze distant, as if looking back through decades. "This building," she said finally, her voice low and raspy, "it has sad places. Corners where loneliness gathers like dust. Always has. Some people feel it more than others." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "It's not ghosts, not like in stories. It's more like a hollow feeling. An emptiness that gets hungry." Her eyes met Elena's. "It doesn't break down doors, child. It waits. It knocks. It wants to be noticed. It wants to be invited in." Elena leaned forward. "Invited in how?" "By answering," Mrs. Petrova whispered, her gaze flicking towards the hallway beyond her door. "Not just by opening the wooden locks. By answering in here." She tapped her temple lightly. "By giving it your attention. By speaking to it. By letting its rhythm match yours." She recounted a story, not from news clippings, but from her own memory, of a man who had lived in 7B years ago. A quiet man, recently widowed. "He started hearing things," Mrs. Petrova said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sounds in the walls," he said. "Knocking. At first, he tried to ignore it. Then he got angry. Started shouting at the walls. Then he got curious. Started listening closely, trying to understand. Became obsessed. He stopped going out. Stopped answering his phone. Just sat in there, listening, waiting." Her eyes held a deep sadness. "One day, his sister came. Couldn't get an answer. Management opened the door. He was gone. Just vanished. Like the man in your papers. Left everything. But he'd started talking back to the walls, poor soul. He answered the wrong door." The phrase struck Elena with the force of a physical blow. Not just the wooden ones. Mrs. Petrova's earlier warning clicked into place with terrifying clarity. As Elena walked back to her own apartment, Mrs. Petrova's words, her own research, and her professional understanding of psychological vulnerability and manipulation began to synthesize into a horrifying, cohesive theory. The caller, the hollow knocker, whatever it was, wasn't a specter trying to physically break into her apartment. It was something far more insidious. It was an ambient psychic phenomenon, a parasitic form of concentrated despair drawn to the potent negative emotions that permeated certain parts of the building, especially intense grief and loneliness like her own. The 3 slow knocks weren't random, they were a specific frequency, a psychic signal calibrated to resonate with a mind weakened by sorrow. It was a key, searching for a lock. Answering, whether by calling out, focusing intense mental energy on it, whispering "go away," or even just unconsciously acknowledging its presence with fear and attention, completed a circuit. It wasn't seeking entry into her physical space, it was seeking entry into her mind. It needed that acknowledgement, that flicker of engagement, to establish a connection. Once invited in, even slightly, it would feed on her despair, amplifying it, twisting her grief into a consuming hopelessness until it snuffed out her will entirely, leaving her hollow, another sad echo in the building's history. It didn't want her apartment, it wanted her. Her pain was its sustenance. That night, the weight of this realization pressed down on her. A wave of grief, overwhelming and raw, washed over her as she looked at a picture of Michael, his eyes bright with life. The familiar pre-knock silence descended. Then, the sound. Knock. Pause. Knock. Pause. Knock. heavy, patient, waiting. Lost in her sorrow, staring numbly at the solid wood barrier, Elena felt the insidious urge stronger than ever. Her lips parted slightly, unconsciously forming the shape of a word. Who? The sound barely formed, a breath rather than speech. Instantly, an icy coldness flooded the room, far more intense than ever before. It wasn't just a drop in temperature, it felt like a tangible presence, pressing against her skin, against her mind. A heavy, suffocating pressure built inside her skull. And then, she heard it, faint, dry, like autumn leaves skittering across pavement, seeming to come from inches away, right on the other side of the door. A whisper. Elena. It sounded chillingly like her own name, sighed out on a long, despairing breath. Pure, primal terror jolted her back to herself. She recoiled physically, stumbling back from the door, gasping. She threw up metal walls, picturing steel barriers slamming down inside her mind, cutting off the nascent connection. The cold receded slightly, the pressure eased, but the echo of that whispered name remained, etched into her fear. It knew her name. It had been waiting. And she had almost, let it in. The near answer, the chilling whisper of her own name, was the terrifying catalyst Elena needed. Passive resistance and attempts at suppression weren't enough. Ignoring the knocks wouldn't make the entity disappear, it would simply wait, patiently, for another moment of weakness. She had to actively fight back, not by confronting the entity directly, that was acknowledging it, feeding it, but by reinforcing the walls of her own mind, reclaiming her internal space from the encroaching despair it fed upon. She had to become her own therapist, applying the techniques she used on clients with fierce, personal determination. The battleground shifted entirely inward. When the familiar pre-knock silence descended each night, Elena didn't just wait in dread. She began employing grounding exercises, focusing intently on the physical sensations of the present moment, the texture of the sofa fabric beneath her fingertips, the steady rhythm of her own controlled breathing, the taste of the peppermint tea she deliberately brewed. She forced herself to name 5 things she could see, 4 things she could touch, 3 things she could hear, filtering out the anticipated knocks, 2 things she could smell, 1 thing she could taste. It anchored her to reality, creating a buffer against the psychic pull. Mindfulness became her shield. When the intrusive thoughts of grief and loss surged, amplified by the entity's presence, she acknowledged them without judgment, labeled them, "This is a grief thought. This is despair trying to hook me," and then consciously redirected her focus. She wouldn't suppress the memories of Michael, but she reframed them. Instead of dwelling on the loss, she actively conjured vivid, positive memories, their first date, the trip to Italy, his terrible singing in the shower, the warmth of his hand in hers. She filled her mind with the love, not the absence. Sound became a weapon. She curated playlists of uplifting music, classical pieces known for their soaring hopefulness, nostalgic rock anthems they'd both loved, and played them softly throughout the evening, creating an auditory landscape that countered the heavy silence. She retrieved old voicemails from Michael, listening to his actual voice, warm and real, a tangible counterpoint to the dry whisper she'd almost invited in. She filled the apartment with the sounds of life, of connection, pushing back against the hollow emptiness the entity represented. The caller, however, did not retreat quietly. It reacted to her resistance with increased intensity, as if angered by her refusal to engage on its terms. The knocks became jarringly loud some nights, sharp and explosive, like solid oak was about to splinter inward. They weren't just heavy anymore, they were violent, designed to shock her out of her meditative state, to provoke fear. The psychic pressure also intensified during her moments of positive reinforcement. When she focused on the happy memory of Michael, a wave of icy coldness would sometimes wash through the room, accompanied by a fleeting, crushing sense of hopelessness, a direct psychic assault trying to derail her efforts. It was a battle of wills, fought in the silent space of her own mind and the charged atmosphere of the apartment. The entity also began trying new tactics, probing for weaknesses in her defense. One night, the 3 slow knocks were followed by a different pattern, tap 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 tap, Michael's specific, impatient knock when he'd forgotten his keys. Elena's heart lurched, a pang of raw grief hitting her with unexpected force. For a split second, the urge to rush to the door, to believe it could somehow be him, was overwhelming. But she caught herself, recognized the cruel mimicry, and doubled down on her grounding exercises, tears streaming down her face but her resolve holding. It's not him. It's feeding on my hope. Another night, after the standard 3 knocks, a faint sound followed, a soft, desolate weeping, seemingly emanating from the hallway. It was a sound designed to elicit sympathy, compassion, perhaps even the urge to open the door to offer comfort. It preyed on her professional instincts as a counselor, her innate empathy. But Elena recognized the manipulation. This thing didn't feel sadness, it consumed it. She focused on her breathing, refusing to let the manufactured sorrow penetrate her defenses. There were setbacks, moments where her carefully constructed walls threatened to crumble. A particular anniversary, the day they were supposed to get married, hit her harder than anticipated. The grief was a physical weight, suffocating her. That night, the knocks were relentless, echoing the frantic pounding of her own heart. The cold presence seeped back in, pressing against her mind, whispering doubts and despair. "It's too hard. You can't keep this up. Just let go. Just answer." She felt herself weakening, the urge to just give in, to acknowledge the overwhelming pain and perhaps the entity offering a twisted form of communion with it, becoming almost unbearable. She had to fight harder than ever, clinging to a photograph of Michael, focusing on his smile, drawing strength from the love they shared, pushing back the invasive chill with every ounce of her will. Reinforcing the walls wasn't a one-time fix, it was a constant, exhausting vigilance. Weeks bled into a month. Elena's life revolved around this silent, nightly battle. Her grief counseling techniques, once abstract professional tools, were now her personal armor and weaponry. She established routines, grounding exercises before dusk, positive memory invocation during the high-risk hours around midnight, carefully chosen music or audiobooks filling the silence. She spoke affirmations aloud, her voice gaining strength, pushing back against the oppressive atmosphere. "I choose to heal. I choose life. You have no power here. You are not welcome." It felt strange at first, talking to an empty room, but it was part of reclaiming her space, both physical and mental. Then, one night, something shifted. The familiar pre-knock silence descended, heavy and charged as always. Elena braced herself, beginning her deep breathing exercises, focusing on a specific, joyful memory of hiking with Michael, the sun warm on their faces. Knock. It came, but it sounded different. Weaker. Less resonant. Almost hesitant. Pause. The silence felt stretched thin, expectant. Knock. Again, lacking the usual heavy finality. It sounded questioning. As if unsure of its reception. Pause. Elena intensified her focus, pouring all her mental energy into the warmth of the memory, the feeling of sunlight, the sound of Michael's laughter. She visualized a shield of light around her, impenetrable, radiating warmth. She refused to acknowledge the sound, refused to let fear find purchase. She would not be its victim. She would not complete the circuit. Knock. The third knock was faint, almost lost in the ambient sounds of the building. It felt less like a summons and more like a tentative inquiry, already fading. Then, the reaction. Denied its usual response, denied the fear and despair it fed upon, the entity seemed to lash out in a final, desperate surge, a psychic tantrum. Suddenly, the apartment plunged into an intense, unnatural cold that bit through Elena's sweater, raising goosebumps on her arms. A barrage of horrific images flashed through her mind's eye, distorted visions of Michael's face contorted in pain, fleeting glimpses of deep, empty voids, her own worst fears manifested as brief, terrifying mental snapshots. It wasn't a hallucination, it felt like a direct injection of terror into her consciousness. Simultaneously, objects in the apartment began to rattle violently. Books vibrated on the shelves, the pans hanging in the kitchen clattered against each other, the window panes hummed with a low, intense frequency. The very air seemed to thrum with unseen energy. And the knocking erupted again. But now it was frantic, chaotic. Not the slow, deliberate rhythm, but a desperate, rapid-fire pounding that seemed to come from everywhere at once, the front door, the closet door, the walls, the ceiling, the floor. Knock 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 knock, echoing, overlapping, a cacophony of desperate summons trying to overwhelm her senses, break her resolve through sheer force and disorientation. Elena squeezed her eyes shut, pressing her hands over her ears, though the sound resonated more inside her head than outside. She doubled down on her grounding, focusing fiercely on the sensation of her feet flat on the floor, the steady in and out of her own breath, the tangible reality of her body in the room. She clung to the image of Michael's smiling face from the photograph on the table, not as a source of grief, but as a source of strength, of love. "Love is stronger than despair," she repeated silently, fiercely. "You cannot have my grief. You cannot have me." She didn't fight the sounds or the images directly, she simply refused to engage. She refused to let fear dictate her response. She held her center, a small island of determined calm in the midst of the psychic storm. It was the ultimate act of defiance, denying the entity the very reaction it was designed to provoke. The assault raged for what felt like an eternity, perhaps only a few terrifying minutes. The frantic knocking reached a crescendo, the cold deepened until her breath plumed in the air, the mental images flickered with blinding speed. And then, as abruptly as it began, it stopped. Silence. But not the heavy, waiting silence that had preceded the knocks for weeks. This was a different kind of quiet, clean, profound, utterly empty. The unnatural cold dissipated rapidly, the air losing its oppressive weight. The rattling ceased. The frantic echoes faded into nothingness. Elena opened her eyes, her body trembling with adrenaline and exhaustion, but her mind felt clear, strangely peaceful. The oppressive psychic presence that had permeated the apartment, that feeling of being watched and preyed upon, was gone. Lifted. She sat there for a long time, listening to the normal sounds of the building return, the distant hum of traffic, the gurgle of pipes, the faint murmur of a neighbor's television. Sounds she hadn't truly heard, unfiltered by dread, in weeks. The front door remained silent. The knocks did not return the following night. Nor the night after that. The entity, denied its invitation, its sustenance, had finally receded, starved into silence by her refusal to feed at her despair. Elena felt drained, but resolute. The experience had been harrowing, pushing her to the brink, but confronting the entity had forced her to confront the depths of her own grief in a way she hadn't allowed herself to before. She had used her professional skills not just to survive, but to reclaim herself. The next morning, she made 2 calls. The first was to Daniel, apologizing for her earlier shortness, and this time, genuinely asking for his help in finding a therapist for herself. She needed to process Michael's death, her own trauma, in a healthy way, supported by the living. The second call was to a moving company. She couldn't stay in apartment 7B. Knowing what resided in the building's sad places, even if dormant for now, was impossible to ignore. But she wasn't fleeing in terror. She began packing the remaining boxes, not with a sense of defeat, but with purpose. Sorting through Michael's belongings was still painful, but the raw agony was tempered now with warmth, with acceptance. She was leaving on her own terms, choosing light over shadow, choosing engagement with the world over isolation. Choosing life. She saw Mrs. Petrova one last time as the movers loaded the final boxes. The old woman stood in her doorway, watching. There was a flicker of understanding, perhaps even approval, in her sharp eyes. "You didn't answer," Mrs. Petrova stated quietly. Elena met her gaze, a sense of hard-won peace settling over her. "No," she replied. "I chose a different door." Mrs. Petrova gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Good. Go well, child." Months later, Elena was settled in a bright, modern apartment across town. Sunlight streamed through clean windows, illuminating unpacked boxes that represented a new beginning, not a stalled past. She was attending therapy, reconnecting with friends, slowly navigating the landscape of her grief with newfound strength and self-compassion. The memory of the hollow knocker remained, a chilling reminder of the darkness grief could invite, but it felt distant, contained within the walls of that old building. One crisp autumn evening, preparing dinner, she heard a knock at her new door. Knock. Pause. Knock. Pause. Knock. 3 slow, distinct knocks. For a single, paralyzing second, her blood ran cold. Her breath hitched. The old fear, primal and immediate, surged back. The kitchen knife felt heavy in her hand. But then, she took a deep, steadying breath. This was different. The air wasn't heavy. There was no preceding unnatural silence. It was just a knock. She walked to the door, her steps measured but not fearful. She looked through the peephole. A young woman in a delivery uniform stood there, looking impatient, holding a package. The real world. Elena slid the deadbolt open. She turned the knob. And with a conscious, deliberate choice, bathed in the warm, ordinary light spilling from her apartment into the hallway, she opened the door. She chose to answer the call of the living, having learned the vital, terrifying difference between acknowledging life and inviting despair. The hollow knocker remained a shadow in her past, a whisper in the hollow walls she had left behind. Enjoyed this story? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below.